Good morning, everyone. So nice to see you. And thank you for being here in this room in Garden City. And for those of you who are on Zoom, wherever you might be, it's nice to have you as well. The colloquy that I conduct for the American Ethical Union, we actually have people from both Canada and Mexico. And we've also had one of the Canadians took a vacation in New Zealand, and she was Zooming with us from New Zealand as well. So we have wide reach if we are willing to and able and make the connections. It's possible for us to be a worldwide movement, which is what Felix Adler had hoped we would become when he founded the ethical movement in 1876. So I want to talk this morning about the slogan, if you'd like, or whatever we might call that, aphorism that we have behind us. It was created, this was sown by a member of our society, Helga Katz, many, many years ago. Few of you remember Helga, but Helga had been, how should I put it? She was not a victim of the Holocaust, but she was affected by a Holocaust. Her family left Germany before the concentration camps were instituted, and she and her family went to the United Kingdom. And when they got to the United Kingdom, when the war broke out between the UK and Germany in 1939, she was then put into a concentration camp in the UK. Many people don't know that very small piece of British history, but there were concentration camps throughout the country for people who the British government considered to be potentially alien enemies. And since she had a German passport, she was interned with, they estimate perhaps as many as 10,000 other people, such people. What she described there is that she nearly starved to death. She was fed for as long as she was there. And if I remember her telling me this, if I remember correctly what she told me, it was probably a couple of years where she subsisted essentially on potatoes and very little else. Probably not so different from many other people in the United Kingdom at the time. But this was her experience. She and her husband, Leopold, met during the Nuremberg trials, where Leopold also was a member of the society. He also was German, then served in the American Army, and after the war, he was one of the translators at Nuremberg. So these were people who knew very difficult conditions, understood the political climate of the time very well, and certainly were attuned to politics in this country, both the good and the bad. So she sowed this for us, and it is one of the two sayings that we have, or three sayings that we have in the ethical movement that have persisted over all the years. Deed Before Creed is the title of one of the collections of early platform addresses by our founder, Felix Adler. I don't know when it was put into a collection, probably around 1890 or something like that. The reason I'm speaking about it is it was prompted by two members of the society, one who said, gee, I wonder whether that is still relevant to us today. And another who said, I come here Sunday after Sunday and I look at this and it says, honestly, I don't have any idea what it means. If you think about it, what does it mean? Is it so abstract that it really lacks any content? To some extent, yes. But if I put it into context for you, perhaps it becomes more meaningful. And that is that when Felix Adler coined this term for the foundation of the ethical movement, what he meant was that for those of you who believe in a certain theological cast, and those people who may not share that point of view, that's really far less relevant. What is most important is what you do with it. And what you do with it needs to be focused on this life here and now. Whatever you may believe about the nature of God, whatever you may believe about the nature of the soul, whatever you may believe about the nature of eternity. And we all have different views about that. What is most important is not that. That could be bracketed. What is most important is what you do with those beliefs and how it affects other people here. So when he talked about deed before creed, he was really addressing it to people who really had strongly held religious beliefs that may differ from the person down the street who's entering a different edifice, either the day before or the same day, who may have different theological beliefs. And he says, believe what you want in that regard, but let's all come together on the deed and make the world a better place. He had hoped that many religions would fade away as the theological beliefs were held more personally than they were institutionally. And for about 10 years, he was the president of something that was called the Free Religious Association, which was those leaders, religious leaders throughout the country, but mainly centered in New York, who also believed in free religion, which was, we don't impose a creed upon people. What we do is we come together and we worship collectively. Well, it didn't happen that the Unitarians left the Unitarians, or the Presbyterians left Presbyterianism, or the Episcopalians or the Jews left wherever they were. Instead, there were some people who felt that really none of that was really necessary. That structure, that construct around us, construction around us. But those people who really wanted to do good in the world and sit aside next to people who may have different theological beliefs, that was good in and of itself. And those were many of the founders of the societies throughout the country. It was your religious beliefs, theological beliefs, spiritual beliefs, that could take a backseat to what you did. So the formation of the ethical society was never meant to be a place where atheists gather because they couldn't find any other place that was home. It was meant to be a place for non-theistic. It was a non-theistic foundation. That is, that we don't really talk about theism. We don't talk about those things. You want to believe them, that is fine. They only intersect with who we are when it has an impact on our behavior. And that does come up every once in a while. Essentially, what the slogan says is what you do is more important than what you say. And what you do, in some sense, is even more important than what you believe, although the belief and the actions can't be totally separate. Those two things really do go together. It is deed before creed. It isn't deed without creed. And the idea was, and I'll get to this towards the end of my talk, how your deed leads to a creed that you might hold. Now, the problem, of course, is that there are both good deeds and bad deeds. Not all deeds are good. Not all actions are good. There are some things that are pro-social. There are those things that are anti-social. There are some feelings and attitudes that we have that are really very destructive. We may believe in certain policies that need to be instituted institutionally, and they may be terrible. They may be unjust. They may be harmful. They may be prejudicial. So not all deeds are good deeds. Clearly, the implication here is when we talk about deed before greed, we're talking about certain kinds of deeds. We're talking about certain values. We're talking about those things that lead to a better world, to lead to a more caring world, not anything that you want to do. And since the thoughts and the deeds are connected, it clearly isn't anything that you want to think or anything that you do believe. We're not going to impose it upon you, but it is the recognition that not all actions, not all deeds lead to things which are constructive. Our aim is to increase the good deeds and minimize the bad. Increase the good in society and minimize the bad in society. Now, having said that, religions have a different emphasis. There are those religions who want to maximize the good, and there are those religions that want to minimize the bad. And these will take different forms, and you will find different congregations that will emphasize one or the other. If you want to increase the good in society in general, one way to think about it is let's build more housing. We all know about all the people who are homeless and are on the streets. Build more housing, that will increase the good. If you want to do, what you want to do is minimize the harm, one way to think about it is let's all live in smaller spaces and create the housing that people can already occupy. We don't need to build more. Those are two different ways of thinking about it. One perhaps more practical than the other, but both make sense in a way. Now, this leads me to look at religions along a spectrum. This is one way to think about religions. There are many ways to think about different religions, but this is one. And and clearly when I do this, I'm presenting them in generalizations. We'll find all kinds of exceptions to this. But I think as a generalization, I find it a useful one. And that is, on a scale, you could place religions at one end as being engaged, and at the other end, you could place religions which are quietist. Engaged and quietist. Now, I'll spell out the implications of some of that. You have religions that are engaged, which you will find prescriptions for behavior. Do this, 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 and this, and this. This is what it means to believe this. At the other end, you have those religions which would say it's a private spiritual practice. Doesn't say anything at all about your behavior. What it talks about is other things that you do that don't intersect with other people or with society at large. Also, you put on this spectrum. The engaged tend to emphasize reason, and the quietist will emphasize emotion and feelings. The engaged look at the terrestrial. The quietist look at the passive and the contemplative. The engaged are concerned with communal salvation. That is, it occurs collectively. Whereas the quietist tend to almost will see it in personal terms, salvation in personal terms. The engaged will emphasize our civic nature, whereas the quietist will engage the private, bracket the civic. Now, I'll give you examples, illustrations. And I want to take, again, as a generalization, and we'll find exceptions. I want to contrast Judaism with Christianity. Or Confucianist with other religions on the Asian subcontinent, mainly Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. But I'll look specifically at Judaism and Christianity. In Judaism, conventionally, traditionally, there are 613 commandments, not the 10 commandments that you find that are, everybody knows what those are. But in Judaism, for those who are practicing Judaism, serious about it, they recognize traditionally, not everyone does, but 613 commandments. In Judaism, it is whoever saves a single life is by Scripture to have saved the whole world. Whereas, in contrast, John 3 in the New Testament says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." In other words, you're saved, this world, you are saved by your belief and faith in Jesus and the crucifixion. Judaism has nothing of that sort. Judaism really says very little about belief, very little about faith, hardly anything about the afterlife. Judaism is the 613 commandments. Now, of course, many of us would say 613 commandments. My God, our lives are so restricted, I don't want any part of that. But my point here is to contrast Judaism with Christianity. Judaism is a religion of what you do, whereas Christianity is more of a religion of faith and what you believe. So I would often tell this joke in my comparative religion classes as a way of illustrating Judaism. And many of the Jewish students would get the joke and appreciate it. Many of the Christian students who just didn't really quite get it. And that joke is that there's a grandmother who's at the beach with her grandchild. And she's sitting there, the kid's playing in the surf. A wave comes along and takes the kid out. Oh my God, my grandson is drowned. Please, God, please save him. This is terrible. I'll do whatever you want, God, but just please save my grandchild. Next wave comes along and the grandchild is washed back up on the shore. She picks up the grandchild, hugs him and kisses him and kisses him. And then she looks at him and she says, but God, he had a hat. Jews argue with God. Christians do not. God is interactive. That's a different concept than God is a matter of faith. Jews don't kneel down. Jews stand up. It's very, very different. I'm not making a judgment here as much as putting this on a spectrum of engaged to quietism. And of course, you'll find, as I said, it's a spectrum. So there are more Jews who are less engaged and more Christians who are more engaged. So where does ethical culture, ethical humanism fit into this? Felix Adler had been trained as a rabbi. His father was the head rabbi of Temple Emmanuel in New York. And when Felix Adler comes back from Germany, he fully intends to become a rabbi. He's bringing all of this, what I'm explaining here, with him as a practice, religion as a practice. Well, for a variety of reasons, it doesn't work out. He then leaves Reform Judaism and says, really is not reformed enough. We need to join with other people who are willing to act in this world as we do. And it doesn't matter if they're Jews, not Jews. It doesn't matter their ethnicity, their background. We could all do this together. Now, when he does that, it's also the period in American history within Christianity of the social gospel. And the social gospel was the end of on that spectrum of Christianity that's much more towards the middle, towards engagement than many other parts of Christianity. So the social gospel says, if you really want to be a good Christian, you have to bring your Christian values into this world and make this world more resemble what we think it ought to be, what God intended it to be, which means that you just cannot go to church and pray. So it may not even be important to go to church. You could pray at home. What is important is what you do in this world. So Adler creates the ethical movement at a time in which there's also the social gospel of Christianity. What is the emphasis here? The emphasis is upon social action versus testifying. What do we have here? Or what ensues from that? More discussion groups, and rarely a silent retreat. We are full of deeds which lead us to projects, legislation, economic reform, social action around political issues, indirectly supporting those candidates who uphold the values that we do. We are thoroughly engaged and have been since the very beginning. And it's with due pride that we look at the things that we have initiated and have participated in forming, such as the NAACP, the Urban League, the Civil Liberties Union, visiting nurses, and then here at the Society, Ethical Friends of Children, the Bereavement Center, and opening up our building to many organizations, institutions that otherwise didn't or couldn't find a home or began here, such as Harry Chapin's World Hunger Year, or the Long Island Progressive Coalition, which was never housed here, but certainly is all due to our very active member and the head of the Social Action Committee, David Sprinson. We have had here for many years the non-traditional jobs for women and the Long Island peaceful alternatives. I can't remember the name right. But just as a side, just to lighten this up a little bit, let me tell you something about the non-traditional jobs for women. They had an office upstairs. My study was down here. And one day, one of the women comes down. If I remember correctly, she's wearing a tool belt with the hammer hanging on one side, wearing her t-shirt, and really looking like she's ready to go out and, and build a building. She comes out to my office out of breath and she says, please, please come upstairs. Run upstairs with her. What it was is that there was a mouse in the room. None of the women wanted to deal with the mouse. Wasn't their job, as you might say. Okay, so returning to creed before deed. What I've told you here are the deeds that are engaged in the public. They're our civic outlook. They're public. These are not our, this is how we present ourselves. This is often how we think of ourselves. It's often how what is behind me is construed. But I think most of the time, that's not really where our deeds are. Most of the time, we perform our deeds with our friends, with our families, with our neighbors, or even with strangers, the people who may be standing in front of us when we check out at the supermarket, or the people who may be in our apartment building we don't even know, and we choose to hold the door open for them. Or when we're on a road and we're not sure who has the right of way, making sure that we proceed safely and give way to the other person. We perform deeds all the time, almost from the moment we wake up until we go to sleep. As long as we are interacting with other people, either face-to-face or now virtually on Zoom, these are the deeds that we perform. So what does it mean, deed before creed? In that respect, it means that we try to harmonize our actions with our values in our everyday affairs, in the most ordinary, prosaic things that we do. What we do is more important than what we say. It's more important than what we believe. It's more important than what we feel. I believe this is from the Bible, although sometimes I get mixed up which is from Shakespeare and which is from the Bible. It is, by their fruits you shall know them. But then again, what fruits? Here's a quote from a contemporary philosopher. Read it to you because I like it a great deal. He says, the moral problems of life vary with age and circumstances, but they are mostly like these: tender mercies, love, attention, honesty, conscientiousness, guarding against projections, taming reactive emotions, deflating ego, and self-cultivation. This is Owen Flanagan, who teaches at Duke University. So deed before creed. Very simply, actions speak louder than words. And these are the actions of kindness, generosity, humility, and honesty. This is not to dismiss our public achievements. That we could list, that we could enumerate, but the deeds which we do over and over again in our everyday lives, that we can't list. Those are things that happen, they're gone, but not really gone. Everything that we do lingers in some way. Everything that we do has an effect. How do we measure the success of an ethical society? I agree with Felix Adler, who we largely remember for all of these wonderful public achievements, and they were wonderful. But he said that we really measure the effect of an ethical society upon the character of the people who come to it. How does it affect you who are sitting here? How does it affect you who are sitting at home listening to this? I have one other quote here from Eustace Hayden, who was the chair of the religion department, University of Chicago, for many, many years. And when he retired for the 10 years subsequent to that, was the leader of Chicago Ethical Society. He said, persons who have learned the art of meeting others with characteristic responses of kindness, unselfishness, patience, courage, frankness, and honesty, they know the real joys of life. Think of the experiences that add lilt to living. Most precious among them will be the moments when lives intermingle. The clinging of hands of little children, the devotion of parents, the dreams of lovers, the loyalty of co-workers. Just a few more remarks. The Abrahamic religions say, in the beginning was the Word. Here, from a humanist perspective, it is, in the beginning are our deeds. From that, the creed will follow. It is both the private and the public virtues that go hand in hand. They're not separate. We could see what happens when they are separated, and those believe that what is most important is what somebody does in public. When those who are elected to office have characters there that are severely wanting, sometimes, in my view, absent totally. People without compassion, people without kindness, where does it get us? But private virtues need to be sustained by social structures. That is civic society. Without a society that respects individuals, we also have a society on the verge of collapse. So both the private and the civic go hand in hand. They intermingle. We become better because we are engaged more publicly, and the public becomes better because of who we are privately. And I say this because not everyone can be involved in the public. There are people who simply don't have that inclination. That isn't who they are. There are people who will choose to stay home and raise children and to forego the public sphere. Or people who are much more comfortable with friends and neighbors, but still act as good citizens. All of that is who we are. And each of us has different dispositions, different ways of interacting. It's another way of saying each of us is unique. Each of us will find our own way in this world. But however we find it, it is both by being private in the deeds that we do as an individual and our public persona, that is how we are as citizens. Was the saying in the women's movement, what the personal is is political. All the reverse is also true, which is the political is personal. And I think what is true of both of them to make sense is that the two cannot be separated. We are all of those things here at the Society, clearly on the spectrum they laid out at the beginning from engaged to quietist. We are at the far end of engaged, but we cannot neglect the other end. That is the deeds that we do every day, who we sit next to, how we relate to them, who we see as we walk down the street. Do we see people? Do we pay attention? Do we respect them? Do we make them feel like a person? That's all within our ability. We don't need everybody else to do that with. And there are other things that we need everybody in this room to do together. That's what I have to say about creed before deed. I've probably said all of this 100 times before over the 30 plus years I was leader of the Society. Everybody has one theme in their life. This has been mine. I try to say it in different ways, different times, with different anecdotes, to hope that the message that I believe to be true and to be central to the ethical movement doesn't get lost. So I will say it again, perhaps the next time I'm invited to speak.